Welcome to another episode of Safeonomics. I'm Scott Cuthbert, one of the co-founders of Safeopedia and Safety Connect, and I'm really excited. As many of you may know from all of the discussions we've had at Safeonomics, I do have a financial background, so I'm really excited today to talk to Mary Foley, who's the Expert Service Strategy Director at Enhesa, and we're gonna get into some current and future requirements that for financial reporting that safety professionals may kind of find themselves in. So we wanted to give people a heads up, kind of dig into it a little bit, understand it, why it's happening, and what some of those requirements are gonna look like in the future. So, Mary, why don't you take a quick minute and introduce yourself, your background, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Scott. So you can probably tell by the accent, I'm from Ireland. I'm based in the UK, and I've been in the EH&S and sustainability field now for, I like to say 25 plus years, but that plus is doing a lot of heavy lifting recently. To be honest, it's much closer to 30 years. So I started in the mining and quarrying industry. That's my background. And then quickly moved into EH&S and sustainability from there. So originally I'm a chartered mineral surveyor. So I've always come at EH&S and sustainability from, we know industry has to happen, so this is about trying to make things better, safer, more environmentally friendly. And for me personally, sustainability has always been about a business needs to be sustainable in that it needs to be still in business in 20, 30 years' time. So I know a lot of those terms have been hijacked over the years and quite recently to a greater or lesser extent, depending on where you're located in the world. But for me, this is about how businesses can do business better. And that's, I've always been very unapologetic about, where I'm coming from with that. The company, as you mentioned, I'm the strategy director for the expert services part of Enhesa. So Enhesa, and again, I've been here since we were set up maybe 30 odd years ago. And I keep coming and going and coming and going. And this latest incarnation, I've been here now for the past coming up 6 years. But in the meantime, I've worked for engineering consultancies, environmental consultancies, ISO certification bodies. So really right across the spectrum in the EH&S world. And I think each of those pieces helps to bring a more rounded approach. So just a couple of seconds about Enhesa. So Enhesa stands for Environmental Health and Safety. So the clues in our name. And really, we look at working with global multinationals, helping them with their non-financial risk intelligence around EH&S regulatory compliance. But it's really taking and transforming compliance to make it into something that is much more strategic, gives a strategic competitive advantage, and helps with what all companies want, which is value creation. So that kind of sets the scene a little bit, Scott.
Yeah, and I love it, and I'm of the same school of thought that sustainability has kind of been hijacked, and it's become a little bit polarizing, really, in some circles when really we should be thinking about it as you described as how to be long-term going concern, as they would say in the financial world, that you've got. A long road ahead of you as an organization, and you're constantly improving and getting better. So with that, let's jump in, and we talked a little bit the pre-chat, and you made a real striking distinction. Safety professionals are used to compliance auditors checking if the OSHA standards, but now financial auditors are starting to look at safety data. And why has that shift happened? And how does the financial auditor look at safety differently than a regulator would?
I think is it a shift? I think we in the health and safety world have always looked at it in terms of risk. And now I think it's more the case of the financial world are starting to realize that the non-financial risk needs to be looked at with the same rigor maybe as the financial risk. And I think that's where we're seeing the shift. Anybody that's had anything to do with Europe in the past 2 or 3 years knows all about, the CSRD and the CSDDD and how, sustainability related themes are becoming more and more about disclosure reporting, reporting on activities. And I think what we're seeing is that investors especially have really, started to hone in on the fact that a company's safety record and a company's safety data can help them make more informed decisions around investment, allocation of investments, access to capital, etc.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen, if you've been in the construction industry and mining, and you definitely see that those reports are viewed by the general contractor, by the owner, in those terms. And I wanted to, before we get too deep into the conversation, just because a lot of our audience is in those medium-sized organizations, we'll get into it in more detail, but the requirements, the stringent requirements usually start at the top, with the owner or the GC or the engineering firm, and get pushed down the supply chain. So just to frame it, for people who are listening, saying, well, I don't necessarily work for a global multinational. You want to stay tuned, because some of these requirements will find their way, down that supply chain. So, just getting to the next question, you noted that the new IFRS standards identify workforce health and safety as a critical risk in 41 different sectors, far beyond just mining and oil and gas. For our listeners in industries like food processing, transportation, manufacturing, who might think that they can fly under the radar a little bit, are they now in a spotlight for financial reporting as well?
Well, I think that's a really good point. So IFRS, you with your financial background obviously know that that's about the financial reporting standards. And at one of the COPs back a few years ago, the COP23, I think it was, in Glasgow, they established an organization called the ISSB, which was the International Sustainability Standards Board, which was built up of a lot of different organizations that were already in place. And they built a reporting. What they wanted to do was pull together all the different elements of what these organizations had been doing to build a reporting standard for climate to begin with. But it was about, using the same standards so investors could make better decisions. And one of the elements was the TCFD, which, as we know, is the grandfather for sustainability reporting. And when that came on board, what it did was it made companies of all sizes sit up and take notice. I mentioned the CSRD before. Now that the dust has settled and we see it applies to pretty much only the largest of the large companies. And as you rightly say, a lot of companies might think, well, that's not me. It's not going to apply to me. But now that we have, IFRS S1 and S2, which are the reporting standards developed by the ISSB, there's no size requirements at all for the companies that will apply to. And what happens is these standards are voluntary standards until a jurisdiction decides to implement them into their financial reporting. Now, at the moment, 33 different jurisdictions are on the pathway to implementing the requirements of S1 and S2 into their financial reporting. And as we know, every company, regardless of your size, has to carry out financial reporting. And if you're in one of those jurisdictions, this will apply to you. If not now, they're going through a process where within the next 2 to 3 years, this will be embedded. One of the things that they have, one of the organizations that was subsumed was SASB. So this was the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They had identified and written and developed some wonderful guidance for 77 different industries to say, these are some of the specific risks you should think about. Now, this was done back in 2019 or so. Now they've been revised. They've identified 9 sector standards that are going to be reviewed on a line-by-line basis, and they include your oil and gas, your construction, your coal operations, iron and steel producers. But in addition, as you mentioned, there are 41 additional sectors where they've said we're going to look at 5 different topics that we think we need and our investors need more information on. And one of those topics is workforce health and safety. Now, I mean, I guess, I can send you the details after, but there's a really cool matrix that they have that's readily available to say, these are the 41 sectors. And out of those, this is what we think is important from, is it greenhouse gas emissions? Is it energy management? Is it water management? Is it workforce health and safety? And the very sectors you mentioned there, like construction, like transportation, railroad transportation, like engineering and construction services, like food retailers and distributors, workforce health and safety is now identified as being important for those sectors. And if it's identified as being important for those sectors, you've got to believe it's going to be looked at with more scrutiny.
Right. And one of the areas I know it's been a hot topic, continues to be a hot topic, but it's the duty of care for remote workers. And we often talk about the S in ESG. You mentioned that in jurisdictions like Australia, the duty of care is expanding to include home environments of remote workers. Do you see this trend coming to North America? And will safety leaders eventually be responsible for the physical and mental safety of employees that they never actually see?
That's a really tricky question to answer. I think what we're seeing in Australia is, first of all, the definition of a workplace. And as we know, since COVID, that definition has changed to include home workers. Now, we know there's this big shift back to office, but there is still, quite a hybrid culture out there. Remote workers have always been a separate subset anyway. But home-based workers, I think now the scrutiny is starting to fall on what are their working conditions. Beforehand, it was more about ergonomics. Are you working, at your kitchen table? Do you have a proper setup for your workspace? Do you have the proper, even remote assessment by your HR or your health and safety team? But now we've seen, and you specifically mentioned Australia, that there's, some of the states have guidance now around, do you have a duty of care when you're carrying out your risk assessments for those home-based workers to ensure that they are not at risk, from things like domestic violence? So when you talk about it in those terms, you've kind of got 2 sides of the fence. You've got those companies that start to think, that's scope creep. That's probably a step too far. You've got other companies that are looking at, well, maybe it's something we should think about in our risk assessments. But at the minute, it's just guidance. And I think, like a lot of health and safety-based risk assessments, it's going to come down to the appetite of the individual companies. Personally, I'm not sure you're going to see federal legislation or even state level legislation, across the US, across, other countries. But I think it'll become more and more part of how a company decides to look at their risk assessments.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting interesting conversation. As you say, there's the big movement for the return to work. I know quite a few jurisdictions have announced big moves to get people back in the office. So we'll see how that one plays out for safety professionals. Now, next one's a common discussion that we have at Safeopedia. Squincher's one of our big longtime collaborators and supporters, and they, as far as I know, they coined the term industrial athlete, or at least they were early adopters of the term, and they're big on heat stress. And I know there's been a lot of discussion and changes and regulations proposed. So many of our listeners manage what we call industrial athletes, folks working hard in tough conditions with the rising temperatures. Heat stress is becoming a massive operational issue under standards like the IFRS, and I think you mentioned that's the International Financial Reporting Standards, right? S2 climate. Does heat stress stop being just a safety issue and start becoming a financial risk that investors demand that we quantify?
I think investors have always looked at health and safety risks as having, a potential financial impact. We know if there's, even things like enforcement actions, penalties, they all carry, a financial risk element. Things like, the time it takes to carry, post an incident or an accident, the time it takes to carry out the root cause analysis, the financial impact maybe of having to change operating procedures, additional training. So finance was always embedded in those risks. I think now what we're seeing more and more is there are climate change. I don't want to get into that whole discussion, but we are seeing increasing temperature rises. We are seeing that, there is a financial impact to that, even just in maybe having to retrofit air conditioning. But from a health and safety point of view, now we're seeing lots of companies are having to relook at their risk assessments, or their activities. Do we have to reduce the time spent in these particular sections of, if it's a factory, because of the heat levels? Do we have to provide more PPE? Do we have to provide more rest breaks? Do we have to add an extra shift because we can't ask people to work the hours they had been working, under these conditions? So these are all things that are going to have an impact somewhere on a company's bottom line. So what we're seeing and what we're hearing from, investors as such is, do you have a good handle on what these risks are? Have you identified them? Do you know what it's going to cost to manage them? If you can't eliminate them, what's the residual risk? How are you, treating that? So it's back to, do you have the metrics to support the fact that you understand what these risks are? So I think there's going to be much more scrutiny around risk management of things such as heat stress and the potential financial impact that might have on a company's operations.
Right. Well, in these escalating sort of requirements, there's opportunity as well. And I know our audience, we get asked an awful lot about how to move initiatives forward, how to get budget, how to get buy-in, right? So you mentioned that this reporting shift is actually a huge opportunity to make a business case. So if a safety director has been denied budget for years, or isn't getting the support they need, how can they use this new financial standard to finally speak to the CFO, the financial language? And is this argument now that the safety data is a predictor of financial stability?
I think, I mean, you've hit on a really important topic there. Like I say, I've been around, health and safety for 30 odd years now. And you did have in more, how do you say, less enlightened times, health and safety was a cost. It's set over to the side, try not to get in the way of operations, try not to slow me down, and thankfully we've all moved on from there. We know that getting that health and safety embedded, from, the design stage and designing risks out all the way through the operation is obviously the best way to go. But you've got to, there's always the balancing act. I mean, the safest company is the company that doesn't open its doors, so that's one end of the spectrum. But what we see now is that health and safety has almost got a bit of an impetus in the fact that it is now been looked at through a financial risk lens, with the inclusion of workplace health and safety in, the SASB amendments, that are sitting under IFRS S1 and S2. We also see it in Europe with the new CSRD and the associated, environmental standards that have now been, they've been simplified is the word we're using in Europe. So they've been simplified and streamlined, and the new requirements were published there in November. And it's well worth a read for those of your members maybe that might have some European operations. But under the S for, in the ESG, there's a reporting requirement S1, which deals with your own workforce. There's another reporting requirement S2 that deals with workers in your value chain. Now, you mentioned earlier, where you are in that value chain or supply chain, you mightn't be sitting at that top level, but if you're under somebody else's top level, these are the things that they're going to be asking of you because it's been asked of them, and they are going to have to report on those factors. And it talks about, you've got a responsibility to your workforce to have an occupational health and safety system of some sort. And, I can tell you the exact wording. But now that you're talking in terms of disclosure reporting, and health and safety is part of that disclosure reporting, for a wider range maybe of readers, including your investors, I think, me as the health and safety guy on the floor looking for budget can have a different type of conversation, a more strategic conversation to say, it's not just about, these particular metrics, from a pure health and safety point of view. This now feeds into our risk profile. And other people are looking at that risk profile. So having that conversation might be the key to unlocking the budget that I needed on the work floor to bring in these improvements to help with my understanding of regulatory requirements, to help with my platform or the software needed or the training needed, etc. Because it's a different conversation then. So hopefully, yes, this gives you the voice, the knowledge, the language to have a more strategic conversation within your own company.
Right. And I think that ties into the next question as well. And I think we've all seen it where, you're having to provide this type of information, on a proposal or a bid for work. And so I think it ties into the sustainability discussion we started off with, but we're seeing large companies push these requirements down the supply chain, right? And for mid-sized companies, is there a competitive advantage here? Can good safety data actually help you with contracts with major multinational clients who need that data for their own internal and external reporting?
Well, yeah, I mean, and the short answer is yes, absolutely, because I think it's the data is one thing, the data tells its story, but I think the fact that you have, a robust process, that you have a management system now, whether it's externally verified or not, or whether it's ISO 45001 or not, the fact that you already understand that this is important, not just for the health of your workers, but for the health of your business. And you've got, independently verified and credible data and metrics to support that. I think it already shows that, you're a company doing this for the right reasons and you're in it for the long haul. So that's got to give you some sort of advantage over maybe some of your peers who maybe don't have as robust a management system or as detailed a set of metrics.
Right. And I think that, to when you talked a little bit about the evolution of how safety's been viewed within an organization, I think that we've seen that on the reporting side as well, where previously you needed to have a injury rate of X in order to qualify, and now it's becoming a little bit more about transparency, like how open is your reporting, and how are we able to work with each other in order to improve safety long term, not just meet a specific metric. So I think that that ties into that competitive advantage. And when you're an organization that can demonstrate that you walk the walk, not just talk the talk, that will get you into places that it might not otherwise have gotten you into before. So.
Well, I think that's a really important point to make, because, if you just had 2 or 3 targets, now whether it's you lost time, injuries, or you get rid or report, whatever, in a lot of cases it was the tail wagging the dog.
Right.
Low numbers should be as a result of having a really good management system and having the correct cultures and behaviors. If you use a target to drive the system, personally, I'm not a huge fan. I think it creates wrong behaviors, or maybe not the best behaviors that you could. Having good metrics as an output of a good system that will stand up to the scrutiny and the transparency. I think there's much more focus on that now rather than just raw data. It's almost like, show me how you worked it out. Show me your workings.
Right, right. Well, I imagine there might be a few people listening in today that are like, "Oh, great! One more thing for me to have to think about and consider, and one more maybe difficult conversation I need to have with management." But for safety pros listening who might be feeling overwhelmed, you offered some reassurance that if they're already doing, ISO 45 101, that they have a head start. How specifically does the standard overlap with these new financial requirements, and can they simply repurpose data that they are already collecting or already starting to collect?
Yes. Again, a simple answer. Yes, they can. I think when you read the wording of the IFRS, and you read the wording of the ESRS, I mean, I'll read you out. I have it open here on the other screen just so I know exactly. So the disclosure requirement under the CSRD in Europe, S1 13, if you want the detail, it says the objective of this disclosure requirement is to enable an understanding of the coverage, quality, and performance of the occupational safety and health management system established to prevent work-related accidents, ill health, and fatalities. Now, that's what every company is doing already, whether you're going down the ISO certification route or not. So all you've got to be able to do is show your understanding, show where all the various elements fit together to manage, maintain, and sustain that robust management system. It's pretty basic. The metrics they're talking about are recordable work-related accidents at sites, recordable work-related ill health. Show me a company that's not doing that, and I'd be surprised that they're still actually in business. So yes, you're already doing that, and if you're doing it to such a level that you have independent, certification from a certification body for ISO, you're already almost way ahead of where you need to be. So it's not one more thing. I think if you look at it rather in the terms of, at last, people can see what we've been doing to keep this company safe.
Right.
At last, the spotlight shines on us. Now's our time to, dance in the sun. If you look at it in that respect, it's now great that all of the actions that, health and safety teams have been carrying out, and all the battles that they've fought, and all the training that they've done, and all the good processes, and all the site walks, and this lunchtime, brown bag safety talks, all this is now starting to be seen for what it is. It's part of a sustainable company doing its best to meet its stakeholder needs.
Yeah, and I love that as well, because it's about, we know what's right. We've been doing it all along, and now we're going to get rewarded and recognized for
Yeah.
that. And tying into the budget request, it's an opportunity to have that conversation with senior management, rather than some of the coming at it from that angle, rather than, oh, we have one more thing that we need to
Yeah.
do, right? So I think that's
Exactly.
excellent advice, and excellent way to frame the conversation. And one of the things that you've talked about, if somebody's thinking about this, they're wondering, where to get started. I know you've often recommended that you start with a gap analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So what's some of the most common gaps you've seen between what safety teams think they're reporting and what financial standards are actually requiring?
I think the biggest gap is really this. It's almost the fear factor of, oh, I don't know anything about finance. I'm a health and safety professional. Well, actually, when you read the standards and you see that it's quite generic, a health and safety professional looking at that, well, of course I have those metrics. I have those metrics in spades, and I can show you exactly how they're built up on a site by site or department by department basis. So I think the first part of the gap analysis is to understand, actually, you already have a ton of information, and you have legacy information. It's not just today's information. Companies will have that going back, 5, 10, 15, however many years. So I think that's the good side of it. Honestly, I think this, if you look at this as an opportunity when you start with your gap analysis, to have the internal conversation first. With
Right.
the other departments, with the finance team, with the sustainability team, if you have a sustainability team, with the investor relations team, and just, understand your role in the ecosystem, and understand how much we bring to that table. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the starting points, I think, for the gap analysis.
Yeah, and I think that's excellent advice, and some excellent homework for folks to work on. I know that everybody's back at work in Q1 here, and probably have a ton of initiatives, but I think this is a worthwhile, conversation to have, and something to start looking at. And I think, again, in the conversations we've had, the advice that you provide, it's not like you need to go and get this figured out for next month or next quarter. This is something you can start working on, and proactively be prepared for when your company or your management starts asking for this information.
I think so. And I think, if you look at now as a sort of a housekeeping project, most companies, most health and safety professionals are already going to know exactly what regulations they need to be compliant with in each of the jurisdictions that they operate in. Compliance is your starting point. And compliance is bred into the bones of a health and safety profession. And, whether it finds us or we find the health and safety world, I've never fully worked that out. But, it's part of our DNA, compliance. So understanding that this is going to have maybe more of a closer look by parties that may not have looked at it before. Now's a good time to, okay, are there any gaps in my knowledge? Are there any gaps in our compliance with the requirements in our 14 sites in these 14 different countries? Let's look and just check to make sure we're on top of, the basics. And then you can start to identify, are there any gaps in the training? Have we been part of an acquisition? Have we acquired, because we know mergers and acquisitions are the big thing that shakes us all up. So, we're working with clients where they've doubled the amount of facilities now under the health and safety team, just through an acquisition. So you've got to understand what's required, at that post-merger integration stage. We need to make sure that we've got a good, strong culture before we can bring others into that culture and explain that culture. So now is a really good time to be doing that housekeeping, as part of your gap analysis.
Yeah. Well, Mary, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I really appreciate it, and I think it's been sort of direct to the point. In the financial sort of language, right? Of like, we're not beating around the bush too much. You're providing really practical advice and steps for people, and I really appreciate that. I know our audience is always looking for key takeaways that they can action when they get back to their desk. So this has been a great conversation. I think that we should circle back, maybe in 12 months and see where things are at, because it's probably a conversation that people have had maybe once or twice or talked to other people about, but should be having more and more, internally with their management team, with their peers, and like you say, with the other departments in their organizations. So if there is a time horizon, that you're aware of, or that you're thinking of, maybe we should reconvene and see where things are at.
Oh, I think a year's, a really good time. But homework, you talked about homework earlier. What I'd love to understand is, are these conversations that, your listeners are already having, is it something that they've had to think about? Is it something that's not us? I'd love to understand from you and through them, does this resonate with some of them?
Yeah, well, that's a great assignment, and we'll have Mary's coordinates in the description below, so you can connect with her on LinkedIn. Maybe let her know if you've had those conversations. Of course, we've got the Safeopedia community. We'll have a link for that as well, and we'd love to to continue that conversation with our community and with you and your organization, and make sure people can proactively be prepared rather than scrambling as, like you say, a merger happens, or you're going to bid on a big project and all of a sudden now you need to provide some data that you hadn't provided before. So we'd love to help people get ready ahead of time.
Perfect. So thank you for the opportunity, Scott. I hope it's been useful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary.